I'm calling to report suspicious activity at the old Walsh property on Route 9. The workers out there, I don't think they have papers. Someone should look into it. That message was left on a federal tip line in the summer of 2023. Sandra Briggs, president of the Millhaven Estates Homeowners Association, left her name and callback number because she was confident. She had always been confident. In 5 years of running that board, nobody had ever checked her facts before acting on them. What she did not know, and never once thought to find out, was that the regional field office that received her tip was directed by Diane Walsh, my wife. I want to be straightforward with you right now, because you deserve to know what you are about to hear. This is a story about a woman who spent 4 years trying to take something she had no legal claim to, and who finally made a move so reckless it bounced straight back on her. Her husband's business, and every overreach she had made before it. I kept records on all of it. Every notice, every photograph, every dated entry in a manila folder that grew thicker every year she pushed. What would you have done differently? I have asked myself that question a dozen times. I always land in the same place. Sit tight. Keep the folder. Let the law do what it does when you give it something to work with. My name is Kyle Walsh. I am 54 years old. I spent 22 years as a civil engineer for the county road department before I took early retirement to manage the farm full-time. I grew up on that land, watched my father build the outbuildings with rough-cut lumber he milled on site. And I was standing next to him in 2007 when he recorded an amendment to the original deed that clarified every boundary, every easement, every access route on all 38 acres. I have a certified copy of that document in a fireproof box under my workbench. And I have had it since the day he handed it to me. My father passed in the spring of 2019 and left the property to me outright. The farm sits on the north end of Route 9, 2 miles outside the Millhaven Estates development. I want to be specific about that. 2 miles in a county road and a recorded plat boundary separate my land from that subdivision. The HOA's Declaration of Covenants was recorded in 2004, and it covers exactly the parcels inside the Millhaven plat. My farm is not one of them. It never was. My father made sure of that in 2007 by having a licensed surveyor remark every corner and filing the amended plat with the county recorder's office. That survey is on file. The corner markers are still in the ground. I hired Pedro and Lupe Garza in the fall of 2019, about 6 months after I inherited the property. Pedro had worked agricultural land in the valley for 15 years. Lupe, his wife, managed the irrigation schedule and the produce records. They are legal permanent residents. They have been legal permanent residents since 2014. Their cards were issued through a standard agricultural worker pathway and renewed without interruption. I had copies of both cards in their employment files before their first day of work, because that is how I do things. Diane started her career as a field officer in 2001 and worked her way up over 2 decades. She became regional director in 2018, the year before my father died. We have been married 26 years. She does not talk about her work at the dinner table, and I do not ask her to. What I knew was enough. She ran the regional office. She had staff. She managed a caseload I will never fully understand. When I had a question about employment documentation, I asked her. When she told me my files were clean, I believed her and kept them current. Our son Trey was 15 in 2019. He started helping on the farm that first summer, up before school to check the irrigation lines. Home in the afternoon to run the walk-behind tiller on the kitchen garden rows. He is 17 now, and he can run every piece of equipment on the property, fix most of what breaks, and read a soil test faster than I can. He and Pedro have an easy working rhythm. Lupe taught him to read the tomato vines for blight before I even knew he had asked her. That is the family this woman was messing with when she decided my farm was her business. The first time I heard Sandra Briggs say anything to me directly, it was October 2020. She pulled her white SUV up to the edge of my gravel drive in the late afternoon, stepped out holding a clipboard, and walked to the fence line without being invited. She had on a linen blazer and white sneakers that were going to be orange sneakers by the time she got back to her vehicle if she kept walking toward the field. She told me that my access road, the gravel lane that runs along the east edge of the property, was functionally part of the Millhaven Road network, and that the HOA board had discussed formalizing that relationship. She used the word formalizing. She wanted me to sign a shared maintenance agreement that would give the HOA shared governance over the lane. I told her the lane was a private easement granted in the 1987 deed and confirmed in the 2007 amendment. I told her she was welcome to pull the plat from the county recorder's office if she had a question about it. I told her I would not be signing anything. She wrote something on her clipboard. Then she looked up and said, "The board feels this is a community matter." I said, "Then the board should read the plat." She left. I went inside and wrote down the date, the time, the approximate words, and the license plate of her SUV. I put the note in a manila folder labeled with that year. It was the first entry. It would not be the last. The fine started in the spring of 2021. The first one arrived on HOA letterhead, which already told me something, because HOA letterhead has no legal authority over a parcel outside the HOA's recorded boundary. The notice cited visual non-compliance with community screening standards and listed a fine of $150 for what it called improper storage of agricultural equipment along the road-facing edge of my property. I have a flatbed trailer and a 3-point hitch cultivator that I park in my own yard, on my own land, outside the HOA boundary. The fine was not just wrong, it was jurisdictionally void from the first sentence. I did not pay it. I photographed it, dated the photograph, wrote a short note on a legal pad explaining the boundary issue and the lack of jurisdiction, and filed both in the folder. I mailed a copy of the note to the HOA's registered address via certified letter. The certified letter came back unsigned. They did not accept delivery. A second notice arrived in July. Same letterhead, different code citation, $200. Filed. Third in September, $150. Filed. By the end of 2021, I had 4 notices in the folder and had paid none of them. Sandra sent a letter in November saying the fines were accruing interest and that the HOA reserved the right to pursue collection. I sent another certified letter explaining the boundary. They refused delivery again. The folder was getting useful. In March 2022, a man showed up at my gate on a Tuesday morning while I was running irrigation checks with Pedro. He had a clipboard and a lanyard with a badge that said County Code Compliance in blue letters. He told me he was there for a compliance inspection and that I needed to let him through. I asked him for his full name and his county employee number. He gave me the name but said he did not have the number handy. Every county code officer I had worked with in 22 years of road engineering carried their employee credentials on a county-issued ID, not a laminated badge from a lanyard. I told him I would call the county compliance office to verify his appointment before I opened the gate. He said that would delay the inspection and that delays could result in additional fines. I pulled out my phone and called the county compliance office. The dispatcher told me there was no scheduled inspection for my address. No order had been issued. No officer had been assigned. I thanked the dispatcher, hung up, and took 3 photographs of the man at my gate, including a close-up of the badge, before I told him there was no authorized inspection and he needed to leave. He left. I uploaded the photographs to my laptop, saved them to a backup drive, and printed a copy for the folder along with a typed description of the conversation and the name and extension of the dispatcher, who confirmed no inspection was scheduled. That entry was number 5, but it mattered differently than the others. A forged credential used to demand entry to private property is a different category of problem than a jurisdictionally void fine notice. I sat with that for a few days. I did not call Sandra. I did not confront her. I called a property rights attorney in the county seat named Garrett Hale, who I had worked with once before on an easement matter during my road department years. I described what had happened in plain terms. Garrett told me the fake inspection visit was documented misconduct, potentially criminal depending on where the badge had come from, and that if there was a pattern of escalation, it was worth keeping very careful records. I told him I had been keeping very careful records since October 2020. He said, "Good, keep going." The fines kept arriving through the rest of 2022. By December of that year, I had 14 notices in the folder, totaling just over $2,100 in claimed fines and accrued interest that I had no legal obligation to pay and would not pay. I had Garrett's memo on file confirming the HOA's lack of jurisdictional authority over my parcel. I had the photographs of the fake inspector. I had every refused certified letter documented with the postal return receipts. The folder was nearly an inch thick. I labeled a second one. Early 2023 is when the picture got clearer, and I want to tell you what I mean by that. In February, I got a call from a neighbor 2 roads over, a man named Tom Archer, who had been a county planning commissioner before he retired. Tom had been at a county board meeting the week before and had noticed 2 rezoning applications filed by a development company called Briggs Land Partners. Both applications were for parcels in the Route 9 corridor. One of them was listed as a future access road request, and the parcel number on the application matched a strip of land along my eastern fence line. The exact same lane Sandra had told me in 2020 was functionally part of the Millhaven Road network. I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and read that twice. Marcus Briggs, Sandra's husband. He ran a regional property development company that had already built 2 subdivisions in the county and was, according to Tom, in active discussions with a commercial hotel group about a 3rd project further out on Route 9. That project needed road access. The access route that made the most economic sense ran through the lane on my eastern boundary. The lane my father had deeded as a private easement in 1987 and confirmed in 2007. Every fine notice, the fake inspector, the refused certified letters, the pressure to sign the shared maintenance agreement back in 2020. None of it had been about community standards or visual compliance. It had been a pressure campaign designed to make me either sign away governance of that lane or wear me down enough to sell. And behind Sandra's clipboard and linen blazer, her husband had been waiting with a development contract and a hotel group's phone number. I called Garrett and told him what Tom had found. Garrett said, "Now we have a motive on record. That changes the posture." It changed mine too, though I did not let it change my method. I printed Tom's notes, pulled the rezoning application numbers, cross-referenced them against the plat, and added everything to the folder with a dated cover note. Then I went out to the field and helped Pedro fix a drip line that had developed a slow leak near the south row. And I did not say anything to him about what was happening. He had enough to manage without carrying my problems. Trey was at school. I made sure he did not know how serious this had gotten, not yet. The call came in June. Diane called me from her office at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. She did not call often during work hours, so I stepped off the tractor when my phone rang and I saw her name. She said, I need you to listen carefully because I am telling you this so you understand what happens next, not so you can do anything about it. She told me a tip had come into the office that morning. A named complainant had called the federal tip line and reported suspected undocumented workers at a farm on Route 9. The address logged in the system was our address. The name on the complaint was Sandra Briggs. My jaw tightened. I stood in the field with the phone against my ear and looked out at Pedro and Lupe working the far row. Diane said she had flagged the address conflict to her direct supervisor within 20 minutes of seeing the intake log. She had recused herself entirely. A separate review chain was handling it, per protocol. But she wanted me to know, because Pedro and Lupe were going to be contacted for verification, and she did not want me blindsided when it happened. I asked her how long. She said, "Could be today, could be tomorrow morning." I thanked her and hung up. I went to the storage room off the barn and pulled Pedro and Lupe's employment files. I had kept them in a labeled accordion folder since 2019. Their I-9 forms, copies of their permanent resident cards, their tax withholding documents, the letter I had written for their bank loan application the previous year. All of it in order, all of it current. I brought the files to the house and sat them on the kitchen table. It was about 40 minutes later that Trey called me from the field. His voice was higher than usual, moving fast. He said, "Dad, there are 2 people at the gate in a gray truck, and they're asking for Pedro and Lupe, and they showed Pedro something, and he looked scared." I said, "I know. Stay with them. I am coming." I picked up the accordion folder off the kitchen table and walked to my truck. By the time I reached the gate, Pedro was standing near the gray government truck with his arms at his sides and his face very still. Lupe was beside him, holding his arm just below the elbow, not tight, just holding. Trey was standing about 10 feet back, watching the 2 officers the way he watches machinery he does not fully trust yet. The officers were polite. They were doing their job. They had received a report and they were following their protocol, which is exactly what officers do when someone makes a complaint on federal letterhead. I introduced myself to the senior officer, whose name was Agent Caruso. I told him I had employment documentation for both Pedro and Lupe, and asked if he would like to review it before proceeding. Agent Caruso looked at the accordion folder in my hand. He said, "Go ahead." I opened the folder on the hood of my truck. I went through the documents in order. The I-9 forms with the original filing dates. The copies of the permanent resident cards with the issuance dates and expiration dates clearly visible. The tax records going back to 2019. The renewal confirmation letter from 2021. Agent Caruso looked through each item carefully. He made notes. He handed the folder to his partner, who photographed each document. The process took about 15 minutes. Then Agent Caruso looked at me and said, "Everything here looks to be in order. I am going to log the verification and close the field action. The originating complaint will be flagged for review." I said, "I appreciate that." He closed his notebook and looked at Pedro and Lupe. He said, "You are free to continue your workday. I apologize for the interruption." Pedro nodded. He did not say much. I watched the gray truck pull off the gravel lane and back onto Route 9. And then I stood there for a minute with the accordion folder in my hands and the afternoon sun flat and warm on the field. Trey came up next to me. He said, "What just happened?" I said, "She made a federal complaint. It came back clean." He looked at the road where the truck had gone. He said, "Does she know who Mom is?" I said, "She did not check." Trey looked at me for a moment and then went back to work. Pedro caught my eye across the hood of the truck, and I nodded once. He nodded back. Lupe picked up the irrigation line she had set down when the officers arrived and walked back to the south row without looking toward the road. The review that Agent Caruso mentioned did not take long to open. Because Diane had recused herself and flagged the complaint the same morning she saw it, the intake record was clean and the conflict of interest was documented on her side, not against her. The review chain had the complaint, the originating name and callback number Sandra had provided, the field verification outcome, and the timeline of prior documented incidents that Garrett had been building into a formal record over the previous 18 months. That documentation did not create the inquiry. The inquiry opened because a named individual had filed a federal complaint that turned out to be unsupported, and the reviewer assigned to the case followed the evidence where it led. The evidence led to 14 HOA fine notices against a property outside the HOA's recorded boundary. It led to a fake inspector photographed at my gate with a non-issued badge. It led to 2 rezoning applications filed by Briggs Land Partners targeting a parcel tied to that same property. It led to a pattern of escalating pressure that began in 2020 and ended with a federal tip designed, as the complaint record would later show, to destabilize the farm's workforce ahead of what Marcus had hoped would be a forced sale or an easement concession. That is not a community standards dispute. That is a coordinated effort to use administrative pressure and eventually a federal agency as a tool to acquire private land. And when you leave a name and callback number on a federal tip line, you make yourself very easy to find. Garrett filed a formal response to the county board on my behalf in August, attaching the full documentation file. The board had already seen the rezoning applications from Briggs Land Partners. They had not yet seen the context behind them. When they did, the applications were pulled from the active docket within 10 days. The county did not immediately move to rezone my land, because there was no longer anyone pushing them to. Marcus withdrew his 2 applications before they could be denied on the record. I am told by Tom Archer that the hotel group on Route 9 found a different access corridor. I do not know whether that is accurate, and I do not much care. The lane on my eastern boundary is still mine. The 2007 amendment still says what it says. The corner markers are still in the ground. The HOA board held a special meeting in September 2023. I was not there and was not invited. What I know came from 3 separate Millhaven residents who called me afterward to apologize. They had not known the fines were being sent to a parcel outside the boundary. Some of them had not known my farm was outside the boundary at all. Sandra had presented my refusals to the board as a compliance problem, not a jurisdiction problem, and most board members had taken her word for it without pulling the plat. Once the plat was on the table, the situation was clear. Sandra resigned from the board presidency at that meeting before a vote to remove her could be called. I was told the vote was coming, and she stepped out ahead of it, which I suppose is its own kind of answer. The federal misuse inquiry concluded in the fall of 2023. I was not a party to it, and the specifics are not mine to detail. What I can tell you is that Garrett confirmed to me in November that the complaint record was officially closed with a finding that the originating tip was unsupported and potentially retaliatory. That finding is on record. Whether it goes further is a matter for other people in other offices. I kept my copies. I drove out to the farm on the first Saturday after Thanksgiving that year. The air was cold, and the sky was the particular flat gray that sits over the valley before the first hard freeze. Trey was already out there when I arrived, working with Pedro to pull the last of the winter squash from the south row. Lupe was at the packing table under the barn overhang, sorting the squash by size and stacking them in wooden bins we have used since my father built them in the late 1980s. I stood at the gate for a minute before I walked in. The gravel lane ran straight east along the fence line, same as it always had. The corner marker my father set in 2007 stood at the far end where the lane met the field road, painted white, still square in the ground. I have walked that boundary a dozen times since this started. I know every post and every marker. Pedro looked up from the row and said, "Mr. Kyle, you want to help or just watch?" I said, "I will help." He handed me a pair of work gloves and pointed at the vine end of the row. I pulled squash for an hour in the cold with my son and my farm hands, and nobody talked much. The way people do not talk much when the work is familiar and the ground is solid under their feet. Before I left that afternoon, I went to the storage room and looked at the folder shelf for a moment. 2 thick manila folders with year tabs, a third one started. 14 fine notices, 1 fake badge photograph, 2 rezoning application numbers, 1 federal tip filing date, 1 completed verification, 1 closed inquiry finding. Every entry dated, every document present. I left them where they were. They had done their job. There is a practical lesson in all of this, and I want to say it plainly before I let you go. Read your deed. Know exactly where your boundary sits, not roughly, but exactly, with a recorded survey and corner markers you can put your hand on. When someone makes a claim against your property, do not argue, do not escalate, and do not sign anything. Request the source document. If they cannot produce one, that is your answer. Write it down, date it, file it. Every notice, every letter, every phone call, every visit from someone with a clipboard or a lanyard badge. Write it down and file it. Not because you are planning to fight, but because a clean, dated, organized record is what converts 4 years of someone else's bad behavior into one very short meeting at a county board table. The folder does the talking. You just have to keep feeding it. Know who you are dealing with. Check the deed, the plat, the recorded covenants, the professional background, the employer, the family connection. Sandra Briggs called a federal office to report workers on a farm owned by the husband of the woman who ran that office. And she did it because she had spent 4 years assuming that nobody across the fence from her had ever thought to keep records or ask the same questions she was depending on them not to ask. That assumption was the only thing her whole plan was built on. One assumption, never checked, left out in the open for 4 years like a corner marker she walked past every time without reading it. If this story made you think about your own deed or your own property line, leave a comment. Tell me where you landed. If you found this useful, subscribe, because next time I am going to walk you through what happened when a neighboring county tried to claim a water easement over land my family has owned since 1961. And the man who finally settled it had been carrying the original survey in his truck for 11 years, waiting for someone to ask. I will see you then.